The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this ILX webinar on identifying and managing resistance to change. My name's Alice and I work in the marketing team here at ILX. And in a minute, I'm going to hand you over to our change management lead trainer, Andy West, who's going to take you through the presentation today. But first, we've just got a couple of housekeeping notes. So at the end of the webinar, we'll be running a Q&A session. So if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, then make sure you stick around until the end and we will try and get through as many as we can. We'll be sending out a follow-up email next week to the webinar, which will have some extra resources in it. So there'll be a link to the presentation on YouTube and on SlideShare as well. Make sure you follow us on social media if you haven't already. And if you can, there should be a 3-question feedback form at the end of the webinar, which we would really appreciate if you could fill out for us. And yeah, that's about it. So I'll hand you over. I'll be chatting to you briefly at the end of the podcast, not the podcast, sorry, the webinar. But I'm going to hand you over now to Andy West.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. As it says here, Andy West. I'm a project and change management trainer. I've been involved in projects for far longer than I actually care to remember, but there you go. I've worked in a couple of organizations where they've done some quite significant change management. One, I was really a subject. The second, I was actually much more involved in trying to change the culture across the organization. So that's my kind of background. And I work with quite a large number of organizations about designing project and change management training programs as we go through. So what's today all about? Well, the webinar. Very briefly, to look at how change is achieved and sometimes why it doesn't. So I'm going to have a look at just the word change and how we try and deliver change. And then start to look at what goes on in organizations. How do people react to change? What sort of things there might be in terms of barriers and therefore resistance. Why people are saying, no, I don't want to play along. And then have a look at some kind of action planning. Things we should think about in terms of how to try and deal with this. So I guess the starting place is, what do we mean by change? Well, I just kind of went to a dictionary and went, what's change? And so we've got to make the form, nature, or content something different from what it is now. And it's just that kind of thought process of altering things. There's an interesting thought process here. There was an argument a little while ago. Are we talking about changing organizations? Are we talking about transformation? Is change just something that we kind of do little steps? Whereas really what we're talking about is transformation, transforming our organizations into kind of different ways. I guess it's a scale thing more than anything else. If we look at how organizations change, they have to evolve, they have to adapt to see what's going on in the outside world and with kind of technology and those sorts of things. So change is about keeping pace with the world more than anything else. And when you look at this, all the words tell us that projects are the most effective way of delivering change in organizations. And so we come to think of what's the difference between projects and change. Well, project is kind of a technical exercise. It's about delivering a capability. Projects tend to focus on output. I'm going to deliver this wonderful thing. And this morning I went online and had a kind of look, project management success statistics. And interestingly, statistics I found this morning said that in high-performing organizations, 89% of projects are completed. Doesn't say whether they're completed on time, but says we actually finish 89% of projects. In low-performing organizations, only 36% of projects actually complete. So a third of projects actually get to the end and 2/3 don't. Now that's kind of interesting. But when does the change happen? When is that change actually embedded? Well, if the project delivers a capability, a kind of thing, then it's when the users, the targets, the audience of that capability actually use it. If you look at it in kind of simple marketing terms, if I built a new product and I was trying to sell it to you, that product is only a success if you actually buy it. And there's probably more than me just making that product. I need to make you aware of it. I need to get you interested in it and you desire that particular product. And if you don't, then all my efforts go to waste. And the change doesn't happen, essentially. I don't take over the market. I don't become this year's millionaire again. So interesting this morning, I thought, well, let's have a look at change management statistics. And the change management statistics tell us that 70% of change initiatives fail, don't achieve the kind of result or payback that actually you're after, which seems a huge number. We're doing lots and lots of projects, and some of us are really quite good at delivering them, but a lot of those are not having the kind of desired effect. And the same website actually says that this kind of failure rate is driven by two things: negative employee attitudes and unproductive management behavior. And if you look at that, both of those are about resistance to change. So we have quite an interesting kind of thought process that goes in here. So my simplistic way of thinking about change happens when we deliver the right capability, the thing the organization actually needs. Ability, the target audience, the users, can they use what we've been delivered? Now that may come down to education, it may come down to training, or it may come down to the fact that it's very, very simple to use and therefore we don't need to train them. But the third one there is then their willingness, their buy-in, their interest. And this is often the most difficult thing, because as humans, we build patterns in our lives. And once we fall into those patterns, we like to stay there. If you think about, if you're male, if you think about how you shave in the morning, if you think about how you put your makeup on, you probably do it in the same way most days without thinking about it. You're unconsciously competent. You're doing it automatically. And it's a comfort zone. And interestingly, we call that in organizations the kind of psychological contract. It's the kind of arrangements, the kind of perception of mutual obligations, which is how the CIPD actually define a kind of psychological contract, is that if I behave like this, then my organization will look after me like that, which is great while it's all stable. But if the organization decides to change, they're changing their side of the contract. And therefore, as an individual, I'm kind of in that worrying position of going, this is kind of unfair. That's not what I expected. That's not what I wanted. And therefore, I'm going to react. And it doesn't matter how big or how small the change is, whether it's positive or negative. There's always some quick look at that, what's going on, and going, I'm not sure about this. So it's, how do I behave? So I'm going to look at a number of things about how people react to change, how people behave through change, a couple of models that just kind of say, what's going to make a change work? And then when I come to look at resistance, come back and look at what elements of those models might be in play. So first thing to consider this, and if you've worked in change or dealt with these sorts of things before, you may well have seen this, and it's the Kubler-Ross curve. Now, originally, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross put this together for people's reactions to imminent death or terminal illness. And it's been looked at and gone, well, actually, there's a very similar set of reactions when we deal with change, because it is moving people from where they feel comfortable to where they feel uncomfortable. There are 7 reactions. The first is shock of what's actually happening. Where's that come from? Interestingly, the second one is denial, which is, oh, that won't happen. And if you look at the curve here, actually morale, energy, performance goes up. Things get better. And it's pretty much almost, because things got better, this change is no longer needed. Interestingly, in organizational terms, if any kind of member of a management team says, oh, look, things are better, we might not have to, then people will listen to that particular person rather than everybody else's message of the change is still needed. But we go to that denial thing first. And when we get the message of actually it is happening, it doesn't matter what you're doing, that's not a big of improvement, that's not sustainable. Then we move into anger. And normally what's actually happening here is we're blaming whoever's in front of us. Now, it may be the person who's made the speech, it may be the line manager who's trying to explain what's going on, but somebody's going to get the brunt of that anger. Now, interestingly here, for an organization, as managers, as supervisors, we actually get to see what's going on. We can judge that reaction. We can try and answer people's questions. And it's a kind of active resistance to what's going on, of this is unfair and it shouldn't be happening. The next one is perhaps more dangerous for individuals. Kubler-Ross called this bargaining with God. What I've done has done this to me. And if I don't do this, then these things may not happen. So if I can make this bargain with God, if I change my behavior like this, then this particular incident won't happen. In organizational terms, what we're talking about here is this is happening because I've done something wrong. This is happening because I'm not good enough, or my team is not good enough. And this leads directly into the kind of depression and confusion, which is where people are looking at going, well, I don't know what's the right way forward. I thought I was doing the right thing. Where's this come from? And the problem here is that people kind of oscillate back to step number 4, the self-blame, and then back into the depression and confusion. What we need is to get them to see the light at the end of the tunnel, that it's an organizational thing. It's about where the organization works. It's about how the organization is doing. It's not a personal matter. And that hopefully gets us to acceptance, which is this is an organizational thing. This is about the requirements of the organization, the changes in technology or whatever else it might be, the needs of the organization. It's not a personal thing. That doesn't mean that people are now fully on board. All it means is the light has been turned on at the end of the tunnel, that they can see that there's an end to this particular process. And what we're really looking for, of course, is the last one, which is problem solving, which is people are now looking at it going, well, what do I get out of this change? Where's the value in it for me? Now, this, of course, is the end of resistance. This is now people positively looking at how can I make this work for me? All the earlier steps mean that people aren't ready to do that, and therefore they may well not be playing along so far. So that's one of the first things to consider. And we have these entirely human reactions to what's going on. A similar model or a similar idea, this is actually put together by the head of learning at a water company where I formerly worked. His name is Sudhanshu Palsuli, and he's got a very interesting website if you want to have a look for him. And he looked at this model to kind of suggest the importance of stakeholder engagement and understanding, and therefore what we need to do as organizations to actually help him through this. So if you look at the kind of two sides of the scale, along the bottom we have what's called the capacity for change. How much change can people deal with? If they're on the high side, it's usually through experience. I've worked in an organization where there's lots of change, lots of little things keep evolving, and therefore I can deal with a lot more change. On the low side, if I've always worked in an organization where change has been little and a long way between, and we haven't done very much, it's been a rather stable organization in terms of how we work and what we do, then my capacity for change is reduced because I'm not used to it. It becomes something quite alien. I'm used to kind of that static environment. The understanding of the change is then what we can do as change managers or project managers, program managers. Are we helping people understand what's happening, why it's happening, why it's needed, how it affects their role, all of those sorts of things? If we're in the high zone, then clearly the answer is yes. There's been an attempt to help the stakeholders of this particular change understand everything that's happening and where are we going with this. If it's on the low side, what we have here is almost a failure of stakeholder engagement. People don't really understand what's going on, or we've talked in a language which is not appropriate. And when we look at one of the curves later on, it may be just the fact that as communicators, as the people who are trying to embed the change, we have a different view on the world than the people that we're trying to change. And therefore our terms of reference about how we look at things is quite different. And that may cause some conflict here. But if we look at this, let's start on the right-hand side, which is about the kind of high capacity for change. At the top of the ground, the top right-hand quadrant, that's called the learners. These people, A, can deal with quite a lot of change, and B, understand what's going on and why it's going to happen, how it's going to change there. If our entire community in an organization were learners, of course, change would be easy. Because at that point, people would go through that Kubler-Ross curve very quickly. There'd be a problem solving and going, there's something in this for me. And learning is part of the natural thing as humans that actually help us change as individuals. So we have the learners there and they move the organization forward. Underneath those, we have the survivors. Now, the survivors can deal with lots of change. When you say, can you do this? They say yes. But they don't actually understand why it's important and why it's critical and why it needs to happen, or how important it is that that change is maintained. And so what they're really saying is, yes, please go away. Yes, I've heard what you said, but no, I'm not really listening. And the problem with the survivors is that we may give them a new process or a new capability or a new tool to use. And they'll start using it in the new way, and then they'll forget a bit because they haven't really understood how important it is. And therefore they'll undo a little bit and put in a bit of the old process, a bit of the old capability, and then they'll replace another bit. And sooner or later what we find with the survivors is the change has just undone itself, and we're back to where we were. And the change needs to be relaunched because we've actually not gone anywhere. This is actually called homeostasis, the natural ability of things to return to what they were. And survivors, because of the lack of understanding about the importance or the need for the change, are often the prime movers of those. We end up doing the change time and time again. On the low capacity side, at the top of the diagram, the strugglers, these people understand the change, the need for the change, what's going to happen and why it's going to happen, but actually don't like very much change, or they're certainly not used to very much change. And therefore, one of the biggest complaints of the strugglers is there's too much change going on at a particular moment in time. There's too many things happening. I can't work out what I'm supposed to be doing and what I'm supposed to be changing. And the common kind of cry of despair, it feels like change for change's sake. It is kind of the classic cry of the strugglers. They can change. What they need is time. A slower pace of change rather than a faster pace of change. The last group then, the overwhelmed. They don't like change, they're not used to change or experiencing change very much, and they don't understand why you're doing this. This is the group that is very much stuck in denial, anger, and self-blame. And as a group, therefore, they find change very difficult because of the natural place where they're sitting. So we need to spend a lot more time working with them, looking at the pace of change and helping them understand. Without that, they're going to stay in the overwhelmed. If we can increase their understanding, we can move them to strugglers. We can change, but slowly. And through experience, that might move them to learners. With the survivors, of course, we need to increase their understanding and move them back up into being learners as well, to make sure they've actually understood. And that can be about our communication methods as we go through. Last thing I want to look at then, before I start to look at kind of the symptoms and the causes of conflict, is what's called the Beckhard and Harris change formula. And it's an interesting way of looking at change. And the point of this is that Beckhard and Harris formula says that change will happen, will work, if the combined sum, the multiplication of A multiplied by B multiplied by D, is greater than X. And X is the perceived cost of the change, which will include things like the actual money we're spending on the project, and the money we're spending on change management and communication, and the downside in terms of the disbenefits, the drop in business as usual activity whilst we go to the change and that we're not as productive as we might be. So the perceived cost of the change can actually be quite a number of different things. It's not just the cost of the project, but it's all of those things rolled up together. A, B, and D then. A, level of dissatisfaction with the status quo. Are people complaining about what they've currently got, the process they're currently following, the tools and equipment? If the answer is yes, it becomes much easier to change things because there's pressure for change. There's pressure for, we need something better. So if we have staff, if we have teams complaining about the tool we have, the technology that doesn't work, the out-of-date database, the inability to go and find the information we want at the right time, that groundswell of opinion is actually quite a positive thing in enabling change. If, however, they're perfectly happy with what they've got at the moment and where they work and who they report to, this raises more problems because we haven't got that pressure for change. The desirability. Are we delivering what they want? Now, this is an interesting one because one of the classic ones here is if we're implementing a solution that's been identified as an organizational need rather than as a deliverable raised from the front line, the staff saying we need something better, what we may find is there's a mismatch between what we're delivering and what they actually want. And therefore the desirability of the output of the product we're delivering our project may not be as high as we want. Which of course means they're looking at it going, that's not what I wanted, that's not what I asked for. And of course we have some problems there in terms of resistance of, that doesn't do the job I want, or it's worse than what I've already got. A comment you may have heard in the past. And the third one there, D, is the practicality of the change. Have we looked at the knowledge and experience of the organisation? Have we brought in knowledge and experience from outside where we haven't got it so that we're delivering this capability we're delivering this change in the most effective way. And if we're getting lots of complaints, oh, that wouldn't work around here, or that wouldn't work for us, or that's not the best way of installing it, then we might find that actually the practicality of the change starts to drop. If any one of those essentially is zero, then the cost will exceed the sum. And therefore the Beckhard and House formula suggests that this change is unlikely to succeed. And so we need to think about those sorts of things and see where we come from. So those are kind of some background reaction stuff. That's kind of what's going on in the organization, in the heads of our people. So, resistance. Well, first off, what do we look for? What are the symptoms? What sort of things do we get? Well, there are three classic types of resistance. Three types of symptoms, if you like. Audible unhappiness, disengagement, and sabotage. And these can be both passive or active forms. So, the audible unhappiness, the kind of passive thing is the kind of sullen silence, the fact you've asked for feedback and you've got nothing. The slaughtered lamb moment, of course, refers to American Werewolf in London, which is when the two heroes at the start of the film walk into the slaughtered lamb pub, it goes silent. And of course, what we're talking about here is if, as a manager who is trying to implement change, you walk into a team or a room where you think there's something going on, and suddenly it's very quiet when you walk in, it's that kind of uncomfortable moment when you think, they don't want to talk about this in front of me. And so, although we call it audible unhappiness, what we've actually got here is silent unhappiness, is the passive one. The active, of course, is complaints, objections. People saying, I don't like this. What about this? Have you thought of this particular problem? Now, actually, that's a really positive thing, because if we're gathering those complaints and those objections, we can answer them. And it's a much, much more active way of dealing with those. In fact, when we look at engaging stakeholders, using resistance, using complaints as a way of building bridges towards the change is actually a great way of doing it. And so, although you get that kind of symptom, it's quite a good thing. The disengagement one, again, the passive one, the vanish like the mist. If you want to talk to them, they're never there. Or the classic one of they're sitting at the back of the meeting and they don't say anything. The active version is they reject the invites. They don't turn up to the meeting. There is they're making positive steps to make sure that you can't talk to them. Almost an avoidance scheme. The passive one is, in my experience, one of the most common ones. You have lots of people who will sit in a meeting and they're very negative, but they're not actually saying anything. And what they're trying to do is ignore the fact of what's going on. The last one then, and this perhaps isn't interesting, the active sabotage is actually people breaking the new thing, showing that it wouldn't work or it's not fit for purpose. Now that might be by using it in a harsh way, it might be by doing it in a way that's not actually supposed to be used, they're using things incorrectly. What we're trying to show is that what we've created is not fit for purpose and therefore it's not the right kind of thing. Now whether they're doing this consciously or whether they're doing it unconsciously, I remember at school, and I'm showing my age here, we were one of the first years to have computer marked maths. And the idea was that you filled in some cards that would go into a card reader and it would then, go through the computer and mark and set you a new assignment. It was going to be a huge time saver for all the teachers because we could get this program of maths automatically done. And the start of every term for the first year, one of the people in my year managed to break the card reader by pulling the card out of the card reader halfway through. And therefore we couldn't do computer marked maths. Now, whether that was a kind of unconscious thing of, I think I've done something right, I want to change my answers, and not thinking it through if it needs to go through and I need to do it second time round, or whether that's a deliberate act, I'm not entirely sure. I've never had that conversation. And to do it's only in hindsight that I think of this. The passive sabotage then is essentially a kind of form of disengagement. It's when they're supposed to be booking things on training or providing information, it's not doing the things that are needed to help the implementation of that particular solution. And so by their lack of activity, their lack of action, they stop it working. And you may find that you have a combination of some or all of these in your particular organization. It depends on the strength of feeling. It depends on how angry people are. The active ones often come from the more unhappiness, the greater the anger, the change, particularly if people feel they haven't been engaged in all the process that's going on. The passive ones, it may be down to the characters of the individuals. I don't want to see anything bad, therefore it's better I say nothing at all. But all of these things can happen and do happen in organisations. So, looking at this, where do we go? Well, Kanter, in a blog in 2012, which actually called the 10 Causes of Resistance, started to identify the reason for the resistance. And those are the things on the left-hand side of my slides. What I've linked those to is some of the things I've been talking about this morning so far. So, loss of control over territory. This is a particular management one of my little empire is being reduced. I'm losing some authority. I'm losing some kind of control over things I've done in the past. And I may have been quite happy with that. So there's no kind of dissatisfaction with it. It's too big for me to manage. If I wasn't happy, then this probably wouldn't happen. It could be the cost of the change. Because we're doing this change, I can't keep an eye on things. And therefore, the service I provide to my end customers, to my the people I provide service to, could be reduced. Or I must have done something wrong. I'm not as good a leader as I thought I was. Is this something to do with how I've been managing my team? All of those start to give you that kind of sense of loss of control, and it's particularly a management one. The excessive uncertainty, I've kind of talked about this before. It is about people's capacity to change, particularly on the low side. I don't like lots of change. And it can also be about the practicality. Have you thought the right way through of doing this, almost from that Beckhard and Harris formula? Have you got the experience of our previous projects, our previous changes? Have we thought about this as we've gone through? If the answer is no, that uncertainty can creep in. And of course, it can be we're trying to do lots of things. And part of the idea of portfolio management for organizations is to look at balancing business as usual against change to make sure we're not overreaching ourselves. So this could be a real thing. We're trying to do too much at the same time. And it comes through as that kind of excessive uncertainty. Change has sprung on people as a surprise. Now, this is always an interesting one, in that if people have a great deal of shock, then the curve is much bigger. The Kubler-Ross curve is much bigger. The sense of denial, the sense of anger is much greater. And it has a greater impact on that kind of curve as you go through. But organizations always want to go, well, we don't want to tell people until we really know what we're going to do. There's a kind of conflict about how we might do this. One of the things I think about here is there a culture that says that there are needs for change? Change is going on in other parts of the organization. Do we have that kind of conversation going on? If the answer is no, and it comes as a complete surprise, the reactions are far worse. If there are changes going on in other parts of the organization and there is communication about what's going on and why it's going on and how successful it's been, then people see that change is happening, and therefore there is a general thread through the organization of change will happen. It's not happening to me at the moment, but it's happening to everybody else. At some point, it must come to me. There'll still be some shock on the detail of the change, but not of, I wasn't expecting that completely. So we're trying to avoid, as Monty Python might say, the Spanish Inquisition. We did expect it. We did know it was going to come because it's happening everywhere in the organization. It's something that happens. The two main differences, once comes back to almost the excessive uncertainty. It's about people's capacity to change. Is it, I'm not sure I can cope with this, the self-blame, do I have the skills to pick this up? And that can also come into the kind of practicality stuff. Are we trying to do too much as an organization? And the problem we have here is balancing business as usual, the day-to-day activities of our organization, and change. Business as usual generates our revenue. It's what we're here for. It's what we do. And if we're doing lots of changes, then our ability to do that is reduced significantly. And that's essentially where we get disbenefits from, is the drop in service, the drop in productivity. If we don't do enough change, then we fall behind our competitors, the other people in the marketplace, the rules and regulations that boundary our organization. And therefore, we suffer a failure of business as usual in the long term. And so it's an interesting part of organizational planning, essentially portfolio management, of what's the appropriate balance between. And it's allowing those people to actually kind of understand how we're trying to manage those sorts of elements as we go through, and if there are too many, listening to people as we go through. The last one, there's an interesting one. It's called the loss of face of those associated with the current state. People invest in their particular process, their tool, particularly if they're the person that has all the knowledge to maintain it. They've made themselves indispensable by looking after something in your organization which you're now removing. And the important thing is that piece of technology, that process, was important. It was vital to the organization in the past. It may not be part of the organization in the future, but it did its job in the past. And therefore, we need to kind of recognize that. Is there dissatisfaction with your system? The answer is no. People are still happy with it. It becomes much more difficult. And I'm not doing a bad job. So there was the self-blame stuff in here. Perceived cost. I'm losing something that I was invested in, something I was happy with. And if we don't celebrate the past, then we start to find that people just kind of go, we're throwing all the good stuff away. We're just doing change for the sake of change. Second group then, concerns about competence. This is quite natural. If we're in a current process, we're in unconscious competence. We can do it without thinking. When there's a change comes in, we suddenly go, that's something I don't know. And at that point, we're unconsciously incompetent. Sorry, we're consciously incompetent. There's something new, and we don't know how to do this. And that sense of unfamiliarity is a concern to us. And we're going to need some kind of support to help us move through to be consciously competent and then hopefully practice in the organization so we become unconsciously competent, back to our safe environment of we know how to do this, that we can do it automatically. But it's that sense of uncomfortable nature of, I can't do this. And of course, we get the messages of things like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, or I've never done that sort of thing before. It's not sure that's the right sort of thing for me. And so, is it a desirable change? Is it, is it because I did it wrong in the past? I'm not very good suddenly. Those sorts of things come forward. The change is more work. Well, we want people to actually implement the change. And most of the time, we have a job, we have a role. And what we're trying to make sure is that we can actually do our job and we can do it to our full extent. And therefore, practicality. Have I already got a full-time job and this to deliver this change or to learn something else? What's got to give? If all of my performance management is based on what I currently do, then why should I think about doing the change as well? Because there's nothing in my performance management system, nothing in my appraisal that says I should encourage change or support change. It's all about what I do now. So do we encourage people? Do we motivate people? Do we allow people to actually spend some time on it? Have we got the capacity to change in the organization, essentially? The ripple effect is always an interesting one here of I'm just changing is often a comment. I'm just upgrading this. And I've heard it done a couple of times on some IT projects. I'm just updating a system. But the system update means the processes needs to change, which means sometimes the responsibilities needs to change about who's going to do it, when do they do it, does it move from one department to another department? Does it mean that it's now a combined role rather than a separate role? And suddenly we have to think about out of the wider context, is this really practical? And are we trying to change too much in one go? Have we thought our way through this? And so proper analysis of this is quite important. In fact, when we look at some of the findings from the change management community, they find that some of the big failings in change is not understanding the true extent of the change before we start doing it. And what happens is we start doing a change and some of these ripple effects of, if you're doing that, then you need to, or you must do these other things. And suddenly we have a much bigger change than we thought we were going to. The past resentments one is often a really tricky one here. And if you look around the world, there are a number of examples of that currently. We fixed a problem, it may not have been fully fixed, but we did something to try and patch a problem somewhere in a corner. Now we're doing a change. Essentially what we're doing is we're ripping that plaster off of that old wound and it's all coming back and we get all the old resentments and we get all the old anger because I thought this was resolved and now you're bringing it all back up again. And at that point, we've got to consider how we resolve those sorts of things. And you may not expect this because it may not be part of what you see in the psychological contract, but essentially the the kind of open wound we've just ripped the sticking plaster off is something that they kind of set to one side. It's still there, it's still quite painful, but we think we've kind of fixed it. And the last one then, it says the threat is real. There are going to be some pains. It is going to hurt. And the classic one here is things like redundancy schemes. We're going to change how we do this, and it's about the kind of anger and blame. This is unfair. How are you going to pick people? It is about the self-blame of it's all my fault. I've been doing it wrong. And of course, the desirability then of we don't like this because there's a real threat to it. So Kanter was looking at the kind of reasons, and what I've tried to link it back to is some of the stuff that's going on in our head in the organisations we go through. So the important stuff here is, well, what can I do about it? And what Kanter suggested was just a number of kind of strategies to think about, depending on the reason for resistance, essentially. So they do kind of link up back in the same kind of way. But I've just kind of put them here in a kind of general sense so we can talk about, or at least I can talk about, the sorts of things that might be happening. For those affected, can they make some choices? Do they have some kind of input? If we say we're going to consult, are we really consulting? And what do we do with consultation? If we consult and then ignore the results, then actually the anger and blame goes up, and that kind of anger gets greater. We actually have far more concerns about the loss of control of our territory. Sense of safety. Yeah, with a process, what's going on? How can I make this clear? Have we outlined what we're going to do and when we're going to do it? And the important thing here is to engage people, to help people understand the change in its process, which comes back to the next one, which is don't plan changes in secret. If you're going to do a change, highlighting the need for change way before you've worked out what the solution is may be an important part, because then you can engage people and go, we're going to have to change. There's pressure on us. There's a change in legislation or technology. We need to take advantage of it. Do you have some ideas? Do you have some input? And therefore, of course, we're starting to get that kind of conversation going. Can I minimise the number of unrelated differences, the number of changes we're trying to do at the present time? And that is really about the capacities of an organisation. Are we thinking in terms of those, as an organisational sense of how many projects and programmes can we run this year? Do we have a sense of how many projects and programmes are we actually running anyway? And are we trying to bite off more than we can chew? And therefore, there's often a need, particularly in bigger organisations, you see this, for some kind of project register, for understanding of what we're trying to do. And this starts to link into that kind of thought process of here are the changes we're trying to do. One of the organisations I worked with a long while ago actually always said they can only ever cope with 4 major programmes of change a year. Beyond that, the effect on the business as usual would be so detrimental that actually it wasn't worth doing. So therefore, they limit the number of changes to 4 major programmes as you go through. Where possible, keep things familiar. Give people a sense of almost the security blanket. Yeah? We may be changing your location, but the team are working and staying the same. Be clear on the scope of the change, what's changing and what's not. And therefore, people have that sense of, I know that bit's changing, but this bit I'm still secure on, and therefore I have almost my sense of I can hold on to this. It gives me that sense of familiarity as I go through. The change for change's sake, well, that goes without saying. Change costs resources. Projects cost money, time. We don't have unlimited resources in an organisation. Is there value to this change? If the answer is no, then why are we doing it? One of the organisations I worked for, they were called God jobs, as if I had a nickname. There was no real value to it, but somebody with sufficient power and authority said, I want one of those. It was going to happen, whether it's a good idea or not. And the problem with these sometimes is that they don't link to the organisational strategy. They don't take us forward as an organisation. But somebody wants one of those. And again, it comes back to almost the organisational governance. Do we have a way of making sure that we're doing the things which are important to us as an organisation, that we can tie all those changes to kind of corporate strategy? Celebrate the past. If it was right for the past and it worked, tell people it worked. But also be clear on why things have got to change, why things can't stay the same. This actually comes from William Bridges' transition model. He talks about endings, the neutral zone, and new beginnings. And endings is about celebrating the past, about celebrating success, but also explaining why things have got to change and why they can't continue. So people can see that we're not throwing all our good experience away. We're not dismissing their efforts and their value. What we're saying is it was right for the past, but it's not right for tomorrow because of this reason. It's being clear about those sorts of things. The gestures to heal the past, those past resentments. What can I do to patch those things up? Now, that may well be that I have to bring that old complaint, that old resentment back and relook at it in detail and go through the pain of resolving that again. But perhaps better, because clearly if it's come back, there's still some resentments and pain in the past. And therefore, it's what can we do to solve those sorts of things. And that may be goodwill gestures. It may be we've got to do something different. It may be things that are required from our audience that we didn't think of. Things that they make important, which we don't. But it's important to understand their particular point of view as you go through. And some obvious ones now. Talk to people. Communicate effectively. Communication is not the transfer of information. Effective communication is the transfer and understanding of information. So the received understanding is the same as the transmitted. If we haven't got those feedback loops in place to make sure that people understand what's going on, stakeholder engagement runs the risk of failing miserably. And therefore, it's essential that we actually try and keep those things as we go through. Allow somebody to work just on change. Build in some time for them as you go through. And reward and recognise those people who have actually made a difference to how it works. And that may not be the people delivering the change. It may be the people at the other end who are receiving the change as they go through. If your project change gets bigger, get more people involved. But do it at the start. There's a useful model in the change management book that we refer to. It's the McKinsey 7S model, which looks at 7 aspects of the organisation. I'm just changing. What does it do to the others? How do I pick those sorts of things up? And get the stakeholders engaged at the start to make sure they're all involved as you go through. Minimise disruption by actually the practicality of the change. Have I got the experience of the team? Have we done something better about as we go through? Can we make sure that we've picked up the experience, the knowledge management stuff? Are we really learning lessons from previous projects and previous changes? And how good as an organisation are we about sharing those sorts of things? And so that's often about changing culture. Knowledge is not power. Shared knowledge is power for the organisation. How do I make that happen? And the last one here, it says honest, transparent, fast and fair. If it's going to hurt people, is it better to do one single layoff than the death by 1,000 cuts? If you have program after program, then people go, I survived this one, but I may not survive the next one. If there's one and it stops, then you have that sense of we've got where we need to go. But it needs to be fair, because it's got to be a reason why some people have hurt. And it's explaining those. And again, that might come back into what do we do to recognise the fact that it is going to hurt these people. So those are the sorts of things to consider as kind of management strategies. Now, importantly, what we need to do is understand how it's going to work. So 2 things. First, situational factors about what's going on, and then the optimal speed of change. How fast should I kind of do this? What sort of resistance do you expect? What symptoms do you look for? How are you going to monitor for those sorts of things? Who's going to do it? Politics. Where's the power of the organisation? Who's triggering the change? Who's resisting the change? Have I got the appropriate, if you like, power base? Have I got the appropriate people behind this? Sometimes, as a change manager or project manager, you're not the right person to engage with all stakeholders. It may be better to have somebody powerful on your side who runs interventions for you to make these sorts of things work. Who's got the relevant information to actually design the change and the energy? Where's the right place to do this? If we've got dissatisfaction at the front line, they will want to implement change because they're unhappy. If they're happy, it's more difficult, and therefore we might need some energy from somewhere else. But can I find some people who are unhappy with the current process or system? The last one there, risk to organisational performance. This is sometimes called survival anxiety. What will happen if we don't change? It needs to be real. It needs to be appropriate. We need to understand what are the true consequences of not doing this. And that needs to be shared in an unthreatening way to make sure people are clear on what's going on. It's part of the stakeholder engagement. The optimal speed of change is quite interesting. If we have a slow change, it tends to build momentum much slower, but it gives people more opportunity to build resistance. If we do something very quickly, there's less chance of resistance happening because essentially we roll things over. However, we may get a lot more resistance later on about whether it's going to be sustainable or not. So it's how do I do this? There's no single right answer. It's about what's going to work for my particular project. And one of the things to consider here is what's the balance? Now, Roger's model here for the innovation adoption, it kind of remains standard. That the organisation is broken up into these kind of percentages. There'll be 2.5% who are innovators. There'll be 16% who are the laggards. The problem here is, where are they in the organisation? Are the innovators at the front line, or are they scattered across the organisation? Have I got that energy, that kind of drive, the focus to take us forward? Where are the laggards? Are they the front line? Are they senior managers? One of the organisations I worked for in the past, there was a layer of management that the MD, the managing director, referred to as the corporate concrete. They're kind of set in our ways. This is where they've got to, and they're kind of solidified. And they were the laggards, in that the staff at the bottom wanted new systems and processes because the technology they're dealing with was failing. And the senior management wanted to work in different ways because the organisation had changed. But the layer in the middle was quite happy where things were because they built their little empires and it was comfortable. It was safe. They knew what was going on. They could control the system. And therefore, as a group, they had a huge amount of influence on whether the change was effective or not. And therefore, they could stifle things. In fact, I worked at a couple of organisations where it was a management layer that was the laggards rather than staff at the bottom. And so it does depend on those sorts of things. One of the problems we also have with this is communication. If innovators are talking to laggards, they have a completely different kind of take on what's good for the world. The innovators are looking for things new and change, and it's a natural part of their life. The attitude of the laggards is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And innovators talking to laggards, because you have a completely different kind of view of what's going on, often you get that kind of miscommunication. And so sometimes it's better to have people who are nearer that thought process. So innovators are good at communicating to early adopters, who are better at communicating to the early majority than the innovators are. The early majority are better at communicating to the late majority. And the laggards would actually listen to the late majority far more than the innovators, because there's a similar view of the world about the questions they might ask about this is going to happen. You will have these sorts of people in your organisation. There will be. Everybody does it. For some of the social networks, I've probably been an early adopter. For others, I'm definitely a laggard. I still haven't got to Twitter, and I probably won't, unless everything else gets turned off. But it's that kind of thought process. For one thing, you might be an innovator, an early adopter. For something else, you might be a laggard. It's not right or wrong. It's just that's how it kind of falls to a degree. So, how do we make this work? How do we think? Well, we've got to think about the optimal speed of change. We've got to think about what sort of resistance. We've got to think about the appropriate kind of strategies, what's going on. And to a degree here, it's our managers. Because one of the things that's talked about in building commitment for change is staff, people often like a kind of high level, what's going on and why have we got to change, big announcement from somebody who's driving at the top. But what they want is detail from the person that they work with, they report to. They want to be able to ask questions because they can actually get a proper Q&A here. So our managers, our supervisors, our frontline people are the people we need to engage with this. So how do we help them do this? Well, if they don't find out until the same time as the staff, they're going through the change curve at the same time as everybody else. They will be in denial or in anger. So can we do something to prepare them? Do they go through it first? Do we do some kind of cascade so that we've actually got that information going forward? So they can kind of go, I've heard about this and this is how it's going to work here and I can answer your questions. Can we use them to gather feedback from the staff about what they like about the current system, what they don't like, rather than presenting the change as kind of fait accompli, that it's been decided you're going to get this? Are we really consulting? Can we use their help? Can we gain their help by providing them with the right kind of information, by answering their questions, providing the information so they can answer their people's questions? So do they have extra access, privileged access to the key things that tell us what's going on? Can we give them the answers to give to their team, particularly as we go through? So the thought process about this is communication, communication, communication. Are we talking to people? Are we listening to them? Are we reflecting what they're saying? Are we doing something about what they've told us? Are we actually showing how we're using that information that we get back? Do we have some kind of network where if people don't want to go talk to the line manager, they can go talk to other people? And so we talk about a kind of change agent network. People who may not be implementing the change, who understand change, who have access to some of the information. And these change agents have a huge influence. They can help their colleagues because they're not an authority figure, but there's someone that people might go to and go, can you help me with? They also help line managers by providing guidance on how to deliver change, how to share change, and how to deal with some of the problems they're going through. So they become almost a kind of knowledge bank, a way of sharing best practice across an organization. If we know that the thing we're going to create is going to take a long time, then we should avoid building anticipation of it before we're ready to do so. I've known organizations talk about having a new process for various things. I was just thinking about one, which is we'll have a new method of project management. And it was talked about, and there was a huge amount of anticipation. But the team who were building the project management process they were going to implement expected it to take 8 months to a year to actually build all the things they wanted because of the process they were actually following. But they'd actually kind of almost publicized it like it would be available in the next 6 weeks. And at that point, there's a huge kind of dissatisfaction wave through the organization of, but I need it for the thing I'm going to do now. And it's not going to be available till. Where are the solutions? And what was interesting was there had been kind of initial anticipation and expectation, which then became resistance of, but you're not doing it when I need it. And so are we doing the right kind of things? Are we building that anticipation too early? Key strategy at the end, when do I time? How much do I tell people? What's the phase approach? When do I add information as I go through? Are we talking about change at all times in the organization? Are we making sure that there is a theme of change that we go through so that it's not so much as a shock to our staff? And have we enabled our managers the responsibility, the skills and the time to enable a change to be embedded? If we want change to be embedded at the front line with our staff, all of our line managers help translate that. All of our line managers will need some time to do so. What are we doing to enable them to put time against it? How do we help them? And that can be about information and about support. Resistance is real. It's always going to be there. It doesn't matter what the change is, there's going to be resistance because change isn't always comfortable. Change isn't always the thing that everybody wants. So, can we identify the resistance? Can we do something about monitoring it, looking for it? Are we asking the right questions? If we can get some of those active objections, those can be some of the best ways forward for resolving people's complaints. So look at it as a way of gaining people's commitment, a way of answering their objections and showing that we've listened to them and that the solution we're going to offer actually does what they really needed to. Thank you for listening. Alice?
Thank you very much, Andy. I hope everyone found that informative and enjoyed it. In a few moments, we're going to have a really brief period for some questions. So if you've got any, if you want to put them in the questions panel at the side now. But I'm just going to quickly take you through an offer that we're running for all of those registered for this webinar on all of our change management courses. So we're running 20% off all of our foundation e-learning courses and 15% all 3 of our next upcoming public scheduled classroom courses, the dates for which are on the screen now. And so if you want to book onto any of these courses, you can use the code CHANGEWEB19 either online or over the phone to claim your discount. And yeah, so I'm just going to have a look at some of the questions at the side. I know we're running out of time, but hopefully we'll be able to get through a few of them.
So, how are capability and ability from the first slide linked to capacity from Palsuli's model? Well, capability is usually about the thing you're delivering. So that's more about the output in terms of the product. The ability is the ability of the target audience to actually use that. And that's more about how have we helped them learn, how have we done something in terms of training rather than anything else. The capacity in terms of is more about people's ability to pick up change. Now, there may be some links between it in terms of their ability about learning, for example. And that's often the classic one you hear of, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, I'm too old to learn those sorts of things. I'm losing brain cells, I can't remember that kind of much. And so capacity for change is very much people's experience and how much change they can cope with rather than their ability to learn. Now, there may be some links between them, but they're not directly linked as you go through. So it will be about that kind of thought process. What are the best change enablers? If a lot of passive resistance. Well, one of the interesting things is that the passive resistance sometimes is asking people questions directly. One of the things that I learned as a trainer is when you're asking questions of an audience, you can do a kind of general question. You ask everybody, and what happens is the loud voices always answer the questions. If you're getting lots of kind of the passive stuff, you're getting people kind of some of the sciences, people not asking questions, then there's all kind of what's called pose, pause, pounce, which is you ask a general question, you leave it for a second, and then you ask someone by name. Now, that can make some people uncomfortable because you're asking for input. So again, it comes back to, am I asking the right kind of people? Is there those sorts of things? Am I the wrong person to be asking those sorts of questions? So can I put it into a non-threatening situation where if I'm the senior manager, I might find that the people are quite passive. If it's the line manager asking those questions, do they get a response because it's somebody they already work with? Or do we need somebody independent? And therefore, that's where sometimes a change agent comes in. So there are ways of dealing with the passive one. If I give you a slightly oblique example, my father worked in what was called industrial mission. He worked for the church, but he used to go around factories to deal with kind of pastoral care issues. And people sometimes would talk to him as an independent person about things rather than talking to their line manager or the formal HR department, because it was somebody who wasn't seen as being part of them or us. And therefore, a change agent network, providing those sorts of people, might be a way of dealing with that kind of passive. I don't want to raise this question with my boss because it might seem I'm being really negative, but there's somebody else I can go and ask. And therefore, you might enable that kind of change as you go through there. Are there any good tips to speed up the Kubler-Ross curve? Yes. Support. What individuals need as they're going through the Kubler-Ross is support from their line manager and from the organisation and from others that they may need to actually go through, which says that as an organisation we need the skills to do that. If you think about a change issue, launching it, if you're going to do a big launch of a thing, the shock thing comes from the big presentation. You may well then get the mutters of, no, they wouldn't do that. And the important thing then is the consistency of message to make sure that it's going through. When the anger and self-blame things are coming through, do the managers have the answers to the anger? And are the managers continuing to support people when they go quiet? And that's perhaps where the big one is that when people are in self-blame, often the reaction is, oh, good, they're not shouting at me more as a manager, therefore they need less support. And actually it's when they need most. And so that particularly there will help people through the kind of depression, confusion into the acceptance ones much quicker because the line manager or somebody near to them is providing that ongoing support. And that's the kind of way it works. Next question. Well, those are all the questions that we've had so far.
Yeah.
I'll leave it a minute just to see if there are any more.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to. Sorry, yeah, I'm going to have to cut in there to cut off the webinar now. If you do have any more questions, we'll endeavour to follow them up after the webinar. But thank you everyone for joining today. Thanks again, Andy. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you want to know any more about our change management courses, we do have a podcast on our website also with Andy, if you'd like to check that out. But I hope you all have good rest of days and thanks again.
Thank you very much.